Art. Is it truthful? Who has the right to say if it is or isn't? Does the truth lie in what art shows us or what it doesn't? Let's take fantasy. We have fairies and goblins, fears and desires. Why have we as artists, historians and audiences been drawn to fantastical or imagined worlds? Is it a form of escapism or an expression of truth?
This possibility that wasn't there before, and we don't quite know what the edges of that are yet.
We absolutely need fantasy. Today, yesterday, it allows us to create new worlds and to try and understand them.
Victorians, as with us today, were fascinated by the world of the imagination and everything that was mysterious.
But what does fantasy in art tell us about how we see the world? Or how we see ourselves? What truths does it reveal? Victorian fairy painting came at a time of great industrial change in Britain, where many were moving from the countryside to the big cities for employment. But in times of change and new technology, why were artists and audiences so fascinated by folklore and fairies?
So you might think of the fairies in Victorian fairy paintings as being sweet little fluttery things like sugar plum fairies or fairies from the top of a Christmas tree. But in fact, Victorian fairy paintings are really dark and mysterious, and they can be quite frightening. They weren't necessarily intended for children, and they often deal with issues of sexuality, of eroticism, and opium addiction. The Quarrel of Oberon and Titania by Noel Paton was one of the most popular paintings on display in the Scottish National Gallery when it first opened to the public in 1859. It was so popular that it had to have its own security guard because people were crowding around it. The surprise that you might feel seeing tiny fairies glowing a bit like fireflies or glowworms in the undergrowth, and it would have reawakened this feeling of being in tune with nature, casting a spell on them into using their own fantastic imagination.
I got dead into fairies in Victorian art through this painting in National Galleries by Joseph Noel Paton, which is a really quite insane image that I remember seeing when I was a kid. And from that I got quite kind of obsessed by this idea of why in the Victorian era, this high point of, the British Empire, the Industrial Revolution, why at this point were people going to this kind of pre-industrial fantasy. And I started reading a book by Laura Forsberg which talks about the idea that simultaneously there was the invention of powerful microscopes and people were able to look down the lens and see things for which they previously didn't know were there. And to me, I think there's something of that in our relationship with AI technology, where this technology has emerged and it's cracked open this heightened kind of fantasy worlds, these worlds that don't exist but paint this idealistic space. And I wanted to relate that in some ways to the idealism of motherhood. I use Rococo, but I also use baby shower imagery, so balloons and pink and blue and ribbons, and sort of mash it all together. So the work is an attempt to play between these things, this very idealised fantasy, and then moments where you can kind of see something of the reality pushing through the surface.
The idealised fantasy we know today may be digital, but for centuries, art has played with our imagination and conjured new worlds. Rococo art was a decorative and elaborative movement that emerged in France in the early 18th century, often depicting light-hearted, romantic and whimsical scenes. It opened up new worlds of imagination and luxury for aristocratic audiences, whose indulgences and excess stood in stark contrast to ordinary French life.
I think Rococo art is kind of mad, it's this over the top, and I suppose it's become super kitsch because of how much it's been reproduced, that it exists on that boundary which I'm really interested in, between being both beautiful and then sort of tipping into its opposite, being so over the top that it's too much.
Rococo art created a whole world, from the furniture through to the ceramics to the silver, etc., the costume, the opera, everything. What this probably says about society is that they were sick of the kind of the very rich, regal and very serious art of the Baroque, and that was linked to Louis XIV. It's a means of escapism, probably for the people in politics, etc. So depicting nature, pastoral scenes, outdoor settings, but they were adapting that in a very specific way to show very sensuous and quite courtship, love-based themes. To see a woman swinging on a swing with a slipper thrown into the air from the 1700s, it lets us really think about the humanness of these people and the fact that they had fantasies.
Critics may have deemed Rococo art as being much too frivolous and decadent. But the depictions of love and courtship tell us a great deal about society at the time.
I'm always interested in images and objects that can simultaneously do their opposite, because I think that speaks more to the truth of the world and the truth of the kind of way that power operates. And maybe machines are showing us something that's true in a way that's deeply uncomfortable.
Art has explored the depths of our imagination, our desires, fears and dreams, cast spells on our senses and opened up new possibilities. Do we need fantasy in art? Are we meant to believe in these imagined worlds?
I think the capacity to think fantastically is really, really important and helps us to deal with our reality.
I suppose through art history, artists are always looking for processes that have a degree of accident in them. And there's something of that in working with AI, that you ask it to do something and it does something a bit stranger. And you think, well, that's actually interesting. Let's pursue that a little bit. Or it could be some of the stories and ideas that we bring to AI, which have kind of existed for generations. You could even say millennia. So stories like Golem, and then you've got Prometheus, Frankenstein. This idea of humans making artificial life has existed for a very long time.
From the playful imagery of Rococo to the fairy paintings that capture Victorian imaginations to AI-generated worlds, fantasy has long held a place in visual art. It might inspire, enthrall, or frighten, but it can also make us stop and question what we are looking at, to either make sense of the world or to escape it. That is where the magic truly lies.
Are you asking if I believe in fairies? Well, that would be telling.